how do you assess resiliency in the workplace? My definition is a resilient workplace is one that facilitates individual resiliency within the environment so that employees are able to reach their true potential, thereby making the business itself resilient, right? So if we tend to our employees' overall resiliency, we can make sure that our the company is being as resilient as possible. And I divided this up into different factors. So first, let's talk about individual resiliency. Mastery, self-efficacy, optimism. You know, optimism is one of the biggest contributing factors to being resilient. Somebody who is optimistic, the research is filled with examples of when you have an optimistic attitude, your prognosis for both physical and mental health is that much greater, right? So how do you balance being optimistic and at the same time anticipating things that might happen? And we're going to talk about that. The other thing that's so important with resiliency is connection, social support, right? So the people who are able to have connections, to lean on people, to have others have their back is so tied to resiliency. And one area that is somewhat neglected, I mean, exercise is key, but Dr. Mike, can you speak a little bit about the brain-gut connection? Because that's an area that, in my opinion, is often neglected.
So I have a 26-year-old son. And when he was little, he used to get ear infections all the time. After a while, my wife would literally just call the pediatrician and they would just call in antibiotics over the phone without even seeing him. Because it used to be thought that all bacteria was bad and killing bacteria is good. And it gave rise to the idea that we should have antibacterial soap and we should spray Lysol on everything. And we should have, all these different gels that we rub our hands with all the time. And what it's led to is, this antiseptic ideology. As it turns out, a study was done not too long ago. It's called the Human Microbiome Project, where they mapped every bacteria that lives in and on us. And what they found was startling. It turns out that we're actually 1/10 human and 9/10 bacteria. We have 10 times the number of bacterial cells in our body than we have human cells. So we have this giant colony, about 3 pounds of bacteria that lives inside of our large intestine that we realize controls our metabolism. It is totally interfacing with our immune system. It's interfacing with our brain and runs our cognition and our emotion. Studies have been done that show that people with an abnormal, they call it the microbiome, this collection of bacteria, abnormal microbiome had a terrible outcomes with COVID. So gut function equals immune function. And yet we have so many people that have so many chronic, what we call functional gastrointestinal disorders, whether it be indigestion or diarrhea, constipation, irritable bowel syndrome, bloating, pain in their abdomen. All of these things are functional GI issues that we just treat with over-the-counter medications constantly. As it turns out, we're damaging this microbiome, and this plays a gigantic role in how we think and feel. The gut-brain connection is hardwired because we have this, the way the brain controls the gut is through something called the vagus nerve in the parasympathetic system. But we know that there's a direct corresponding relationship between the gut and the brain. So it's not only the bacterial colony, the microbiome that's communicating with the brain, it's neurologically through the vagus nerve, and it's through different peptides and chemical hormones and these different things like chemokines and so on that transmit from the gut to the brain. So how your gut works really determines how well your brain works.
And what I find really interesting is 95% of the serotonin is made in the gut, and serotonin is a neurotransmitter that is responsible for depression, and higher levels of serotonin has been demonstrated to be linked with, those who don't have as much depression, or, so it's really interesting. And I'm so grateful, this is what we're talking about, taking an eclectic view of mental health and, talking about it from a mind, body, thoughts and connections, and really attacking anxiety on a full frontal attack, not just one piece, but every piece. It's so vitally important. You know, the other thing I want to talk about is how in trauma, the body keeps the score, and how, you know, when we're affected, like Dr. Mike, you talked about, you know, your car accident, trauma is stored. The research shows that trauma is stored neurologically in the body. And when we struggle with anxiety and things like that, it could be from prior traumatic experience that is energy that's stored in the body. There's a book called The Body Keeps the Score that is very well, in my opinion, very well written and very popular in the field of the mind-body connection. So when TLC Virtual Resiliency, the way we compartmentalize or view resiliency education is that we venture and we go from often the fear zone. If we look at COVID-19, everybody felt disconnected, isolated, sad, and depressed. But then when you start learning, when you start becoming more open-minded to the eclectic need to attack anxiety, for example, we become educated, we grow, and then we can start engaging in healthy habits that really address our anxiety and our fear zone, and then we become more empowered. So education is really the key to growth and attacking anxiety. Well, one of the problems in our society is we fear anxiety, and when anxiety hits us, we try to insulate ourselves and avoid the stressor. But we have to face our fear and become educated by it and not allow us to control us, because if we do, we'll be stuck in the fear zone and never be able to grow. So it's really important that we educate ourselves constantly. The problem is that we've been educated, a lot of our, you know, a lot of our occupations, whatever it is, we can look at doctors, lawyers, healthcare professionals, civil servants, people who work with the community. There are certain mindset hazards that we learn in our education or as we start a job that we have to be the catastrophizer. Like, we have to think worst case scenario, right? We have to be hyper vigilant, on guard for the next storm. We have to be perfect. We can't make a mistake. And we have to really be an advocate for, you know, our clients as an attorney. Concrete thinker. We have to think black and white. When you're an officer, a correction officer, you have to not look to the humanity of an inmate right away. You have to react. There is no time to think in the grays. The rescuer, a lot of people who are engaged in helping people feel the burden of having to rescue everyone. The know-it-all, the person who feels like they need to know everything. They can't allow anybody else's opinion to, you know, infiltrate because they need to know everything. And then the boss. Now, all of these things are hazards that come with the work and may help them in their job at the moment, but it undermines the resiliency, the individual factors related to resiliency, such as optimism. If we just look at optimism, all these things are going to destroy the resiliency that a person comes with at work. And we can't ignore it, right? Rich, is there any of these things that you can relate to, these mindsets?
Oh God, I'm the rescuer. I'm the one who thinks I'm gonna solve everybody's problems, and you take that on to yourself. And yeah, oh God, the rescuer, the perfectionist, the hypervigilant. Yeah, I'm about like 4 of the 8. So. And that's a lot of stress being put on. And, you know, and I can go through the top staff in the town and tell you who is in each category there. This is like dead spot on. And Rob, it's a lot of what you taught us. You know, we were fortunate to have you and your team from TLC during COVID. And you and I talked about this. And I needed to get somebody in, not me talking to them, but outside views to educate them, to help them process this COVID pandemic, to get back on the horse, to be able to help others. And I had a couple of resistors, you know this, I won't name names, but by the end of it, after you and your team got done kind of educating us, kind of calming us down, bringing us to like reality, that those resistors, wow, we don't need to listen to them. Wow, could I have this for my, foreman? Could I have this for my under supervisors? Could I have this? And everybody was really grateful to, like you said, to be able to kind of pop outside of whatever category they were in and be able to speak from an educated standpoint, to be able to calm not only their own anxiety down, but others around them.
And that's just it. So, it's so hard because here we're talking about being individually resilient, but we're learning.
Well, nobody likes to show vulnerability.
No, that's the key, Rich.
And this is what I'm working with a kid right now. And I did this, a friend of mine was the assistant coach of the Hofstra wrestling team. So they're a Division I team, they're functioning at a higher level. And he and I came up with this so anyway, short story is I've got about probably 8 of the Hofstra wrestlers in various capacities that I've been working with. And one of them in particular, because wrestlers are taught to be tough guys. And again, it could be the UFC fighters the same way. And I said, it's stronger for you to be able to show your vulnerabilities, to be able to deal with how to process them and make you even stronger. You've got to have an edge on the guy or gal you're going up against, right? In fact, there's a young woman who's a UFC fighter, Jillian. She just won her fight last week, but she and I had this conversation about how everyone wants to have an edge on their opponent. So you could be better in cardio, better in strike, better in taking down. And she and I agree, and we're proud of this. I said, but the other edge you can have is be better in the moment. And we're getting all the fighters to buy into it. And same thing, show your vulnerability. It's okay to talk about what you're afraid of, what you're not sure of. And that's part of what you've done for us, TLC, is to talk about your vulnerabilities.
Yeah. And I think that's so important and brings you back to the personal narrative. Being vulnerable is so important, because only if you acknowledge the vulnerabilities can you work on them and be stronger. Right? So it's so important. Okay. So in addition to the occupational mindset hazards, you also have the workplace settings, right? The workplace settings, which really can undermine your resiliency by creating a culture where employees feel they lack independence, competence, and connection to the job, right? So when people work in an environment where they feel that they don't have any type of autonomy, or connection to what they work, or lack competency, all they're doing is really working for the weekend, right? Do you remember back in the day, WBAB used to sing, everybody's working for the weekend, right? I don't sing, sorry. But the point is, you want intrinsic motivation. You want people to show up at work, intrinsic motivation, not just for the pay, but because they value what they do. So self-determination is another part of how we assess intrinsic motivation, and are we facilitating resiliency? So a place that facilitates autonomy, competency, and relatedness. Rich has the landfill, and the guys at the landfill call themselves the Green Berets. And that's because they take pride in what they do. They feel related to it. All these things need to fire together in order to facilitate resiliency within your employees, thereby making your place of work really resilient, really resilient. So the other piece, in addition to self-determination theory of competency, autonomy, and relatedness, your employees need to feel psychologically safe. That is, they feel that their opinion matters and they won't be in fear of being struck down by having input in what they have to say. And you can see how psychological safety relates to the self-determination theory of relatedness, autonomy, as well as feeling that they are, connected and competent at what they do, right? So, Rich, you just don't, it's important, right, that when you have employees, you just don't have them as soldiers, but they feel that they're part of a community, participating and feeling that their voice matters.
Yeah, we call it the Town of Babylon family, and we say that we've all grown up in dysfunctional families, and we figure out how to make it functional. So it's all about treating people as people instead of, like you say, robots, or just that they're coming here to provide a service. Every person who comes before you is coming in with whatever's going on at home, whatever's gone on in their past, whatever experiences they've had, and you got to treat them as people. So that's my philosophy on how I manage and how I ask the managers that work with me to manage the same thing, that everybody's got to feel, look, it's the old adage, I'm not going to ask anyone to do something that I wouldn't do. And so you have to have the same ability to have the same experiences and to show them. So whether you're a laborer or a secretary or a janitor, that you're as valuable, because without you, the team doesn't accomplish what it's supposed to accomplish. And I make fun of the commissioners, or the, call them the fatheads, and say, I'm more reliant on, Brandon, the custodian, than I am on you, because without Brandon's work during COVID, we wouldn't have been able to keep the buildings open, or be able to provide the services. So it's all about showing everybody that they're all on a pretty much equal level in terms of being part of the family. Obviously,
Right.
there's a pecking order and what you have to do in terms of orders and stuff, but showing everybody that they can participate safely without fear of retribution. Their comments are going to be taken seriously, and we've got to all work together to come up with the best, putting the best team out on the field to accomplish what we need to on behalf of our residents.
And the research that I quote here that was done by Google said that the more psychological safety, the higher the performing team. So the more that teams feel that their opinion matters, and that they can have valued input, and that they share an aligned mission, increases the performance of that team. And that makes sense.